I have a difficult task in front of me today, is to talk about this topic, but from a global perspective. But I also wanted to just briefly come back to what Sir Tiffany O'Regan talked about yesterday with place and his place and where he comes from and the Ngātui tribe. And many of you may not know this, but my place is that island north of here, and is the Ngāti Whakaui tribe. So it's really great to be back here, to be able to spend some time in Aotearoa and also in my hometown of Rotorua just last week. But on to the challenge for today, and I'm very conscious in accepting Mark and Chrissy's invitation to be here to talk about the impact and the challenges ahead for the surveying and geospatial professional community when we're immersed in the reality of a recovery and rebuild from an actual series of disasters. And that we have distinguished speakers in the program this week that will talk about real life experiences at a local level. And what I'm going to try and do today is bring a global perspective to that and look at some of the global policy around some of the discussion that Margarita talked about yesterday. So the context is, I want you to think about global to local, local to global. In other words, as also been identified in the Sendai framework and other global policy documents of recent times, is thinking local to national to regional to global. And many countries often say when they're dealing with disasters or preparing or looking at mitigation, what does that global stuff really mean to me? How does it affect me? And how does that make me change how we do things in our country? And that's a really difficult thing. But in saying that, hopefully I can explain some of that today. So in terms of some of the global challenges ahead, I'll just quickly wanted to touch on a couple of things. Many of you will know that the Sustainable Development Summit took place last year in September in the United Nations headquarters in New York, where all of the member states, all 193 countries around the world, decided and agreed upon a new development agenda. But part of the process was communication, and this is one of a short series of videos that were used in the opening and the days of the summit. And I'd just like to play one of those. It's very short, but it helps us to think about climate and disasters in the context of this workshop, this meeting.
The planet can survive without you. You cannot survive without the planet. When the planet thrives, we do too. It is our common ground. And every living thing, no matter how small, sustains the whole. As our climate changes, humans experience the violence of these shifts. The oceans rise and fall. Disasters increase. We are displaced. Our land is degraded. Our seas drown in our waste. We lose our luminous biodiversity. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. We must produce and consume sustainably. Fight desertification and flooding. Be more resilient, more adaptive. Support sustainable cities and human settlements. We must conserve all that we love. Protect our oceans. We can guard that which gives us life. This is the story you are shaping.
So the three key points about this particular meeting this week from a global perspective, climate change, urbanisation and disasters are those functions around the development agenda that probably take priority for us in this room. Some global trends, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but there's a lot in there in terms of where we're heading with urbanisation, and many of you are already very, very aware of this, and the fact that it's making a big difference on how we manage our people and also our planet, our resources, both in terms of social, economic and environmental challenges. And that's going to be exacerbated over the coming years as our population continues to grow and we continue to urbanise. We're also seeing not only more disasters, but we're seeing increasing risk. And this is the big thing, not so much the events themselves. We create the disasters out of the events with our relationship with our communities and the natural environment. And this is increasing, unfortunate but a reality. And what we're seeing out of that is big economic, social and environmental consequences on how we deal with some of this in the future. And I suspect that as our population grows, as we urbanise, that's not going to change quickly. How we deal with the risk and how we manage that is where we have opportunity. This is just released from the World Economic Forum, and I'll just touch on this for a moment. This is the Global Risks Report that has just come out, and it looks at all risks from an insurance and economic perspective around the world. And I apologise if you can't read it all, but in essence it covers everything from humanitarian issues, migration, terrorism, but also disasters. And those green diamonds, if you could call them that, are the ones around environmental and natural catastrophes and disasters. And as you can see, our region is very much predominant in those risks from a global perspective. The 2015 Global Assessment Report talked a lot about the relationship on disaster risk, but also with climate change. We know that until the last year or two, and as we went into Sendai and then into COP21 later last year, is trying to get a strong emphasis on the relationship between these two processes that are taking place. So a bit of a global context. The question then is, what's our opportunity and what can we do about it? And I'd like to talk about this policy context to a certain degree, because within the UN system, this is what we've been dealing with since Rio+20 in 2012. Some of you may recall that in 2014 at the FIG Congress, I spoke about, at that time, the post-2015 development agenda, and we talked about how you measure and monitor, and how you do it with place and geography, and how the surveying community can engage with the challenges and look at how it addresses what was a proposal on sustainable development coming up in 2015. And at that time I talked about 3 pillars of potential influence around sustainable development, and then the science and technology, what we bring to the table in terms of our professional resources, but also the policy framework, which was still being evolving at the time and to be decided at the political level around the world. And now we're there, we're at that. In 2015, the development agenda became the 2030 agenda. And it was framed around people, planet and prosperity. It was people in terms of social, prosperity, economic, and planet, the environmental side of the pillars of sustainable development. But it also talked a lot about partnership and peace. And the partnership was really what we need to think about in terms of working together, private, public, across countries and across communities. And framed around the 2030 agenda also, as Margarita mentioned yesterday, are the Sendai framework, the COP21 climate framework, and also the new agreement that was actually formalised just a couple of weeks ago, and what's coming up in terms of Habitat 3 in the urban program, the new urban agenda that will take place in Quito in October of this year. So this is that new development agenda, and what it actually does is provide a global policy, and we're not always necessarily connected to that. But it is a blueprint for us. It's a blueprint for what we do over the next 15 years. It's anchored by 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, and now, as agreed earlier this year in March, 230 global indicators. And those indicators are going to be driven by data. And that data is how countries will then measure and monitor their progress against the goals and targets over the next 15 years. Particularly in there, through a lot of efforts, is the recognition and need for geospatial information and Earth observations. And I'll come back to that shortly. But also importantly is how do you address the least developed countries, the landlocked developing countries, the SIDS countries, rather than the developed countries, and how we move that agenda forward. I'm not going to touch on this too much, but Sendai also talked about, under its 4 priorities for action, the need for, when we talk about disaster risk, geospatial information. We know that, but the question is, how do we use it? How do we leverage these formal documents that are decided by politicians and decision makers around the world? What does that really mean to us? The climate conference is one that was even more difficult because that's a bit more nebulous. For example, the idea was that countries could agree to 2 degrees of a rise in temperature over the next years, but that was actually negotiated back to 1.5 degrees. But at least 175 countries signed up to the new agreement on climate change. When you bring all of these together, the key thing about this is that there are many targets and indicators that sit in Sendai, that sit in the climate change framework, and also sit within the 2030 development agenda that mean looking at how we use our data and our information in moving forward in our decision-making process. So we have an agenda. It is an actionable agenda. But what does this really mean to us? And this is something that we within the UN Secretariat have been trying to explain to countries, to the diplomats and the permanent missions over the last year or so. One of the means of doing this was looking at what we have not been able to do through the Millennium Development Goals. The final MDG report, which was released by the Secretary General in July last year, had a particular chapter on how we did not measure well because we did not have the data to measure well. And that if we had more geospatial information, we would have done a much better job. And in fact, what did not get measured did not get counted. And so these were really important messages for leading into the 2030 agenda. Also, within the FIG community, you've also been working very hard on this. And I'll use the report that was just put out in 2014 through John Hanna and other colleagues within FIG, looking at climate in particular, but talking about integration of data sets, spatial data infrastructures, and what role they play in bringing information to the table, making it accessible, usable for mitigation, response, recovery in disasters. Integration is absolutely important, but it's also integration of our professional communities, not just of data. And this is a big message that's been circulated in New York through the UN system, is that we need to collaborate, coordinate, work together more within our communities. And within UNGGIM, we have focused specifically on these 4 professional communities: statistics, geospatial, surveying, and observations, because they, in essence, provide the data for the global indicator framework. What do I mean by that? Goal 17 and paragraph 18 of that specifically talks about data monitoring and accountability. Many of you may know this already, but in there the question is, what do we mean by disaggregated data? What do we mean by geographic location? And how do we deal with that with the least developed countries by 2020? And I suggest that while this looks really doable, across all countries around the world, that's a very difficult ask right at this point in time. So let me try and explain, I guess, an approach on how we're trying to think about some of that. So at the forefront, we need to measure and monitor progress. We have goals, we have targets, we have indicators. That indicator framework has been commissioned by the UN General Assembly for the statistical community to come up with the indicators, and they're very, very advanced with that. But what they're now realising with geographic location and data that's disaggregated, in other words, information about people and place that is just not at a national level but at a sub-national level, how do we deal with that without geographic location? So now the community expands. We need to think more about Earth observation data, in situ monitoring, geospatial information, and methods and processes to bring that data to bear. And this is a big challenge within our global community. Another way of approaching it, in terms of a simple diagram that I used for the Statistical Commission this past March, is that at the very base there is local conditions. This is the reality of the real world, whether you're sitting in Burkina Faso, in London, or here in New Zealand, is that we have our own national conditions and circumstances. We have different frameworks that we have across our countries. They will be official statistical frameworks. There will be geospatial frameworks, such as national spatial data infrastructures. There will be Earth monitoring and other types of information. And now this more informal VGI, big data, new information sources that are becoming available. And somehow we need to be able to bring all of that together to contribute to the indicators of the SDGs. And there's 230 indicators in there that need to become official representations of countries. So integration is going to be absolutely vital over the next 15 years in terms of how we do this. And then as an outcome of that, obviously we get up to our regional and our global reporting. Now, if I just pick, for example, the national spatial data infrastructures, many of us already have our fundamental data. But it's about saying, how do we reconstitute that fundamental data into these three pillars of sustainable development? How do we think about our information on topography, on elevation, positioning, transport, administrative boundaries, addresses, land use, land cover? And we think about that in the context of 17 goals and targets, and how we reshape not only our data, but we reshape our organisations, and we reshape our professional integration and collaboration across our communities. Because if we don't do this, we're going to continue to run as isolated agencies, as stovepipes, and not be progressing our agenda in the years to come. I'm almost finished. I'm just quickly going to talk about what this means, for example, talking to the statistical community as the owner of the indicator framework and as the owner of reporting the Sustainable Development Goals to the General Assembly each year. It's absolutely important, and they now recognise this, that you do this with geospatial information. So we ran a very big event in New York earlier this year, but demonstrating exactly how and where geospatial fits into goals and targets and indicators of the development agenda. And this resonates with politicians now and some of these decision makers. The challenge for us is to take these examples and make them work, and actually make them production mode. And I would suggest we need to do this in the next 2 or 3 years. On the left side there, you can see each of the goals. Across the top, are examples where geospatial Earth observation surveying contributes to those goals. Very simplistic, but a very important message on how we deal with some of the challenges we have over the next 15 years. Again, I'll just come back to, this is my final slide. If we do not do this as geospatial communities, as professional communities, if we do not integrate and work together across some of these challenges, we will fail. But I believe that we are at a place in time in the world, and with our technology, with our data availability, to actually make this work. And in essence, for many of the developing countries around the world, we need to make this work. And I think that they will resonate with that kind of message. Thank you for your time. Kia ora.